How can we make the world better? By making ourselves better. The Dr. Joe Show explores how you can make positive personal change by using his groundbreaking and highly effective I Am approach to understand who we are and why we do what we do. Your small changes can have big effects.
Join us now for the Dr. Joe Show with Mark Stiles of Stiles Law, Thomas McCoy, and your host, Dr. Joe Schrand.
Stretch the kindness.
Welcome to the Dr. Joe Show.
Well, thank you, Tom. That was succinct and to the point.
Thank you.
Nicely done. How have you been? What's been going on?
Well, there's a lot been going on, Dr. Joe. We live in the great state of Massachusetts. It's like one of the big healthcare capitals of the world, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And one of the amazing institutions we have here is Boston Children's Hospital.
Yep.
And they have been receiving threat after threat.
It is unfathomable. What are these threats about, Tom?
These threats are about misunderstandings about the nature of gender-affirming care. There have been 2 bomb threats so far, and people might be wondering, like, how could someone get to the point where they're sending bomb threats to a children's hospital? I understand.
You do?
I do. I know the process these people underwent to think the things they think. And to help everyone understand it, I have on the show today Brianna Wu, an MMA professional ass kicker, Alana McLaughlin.
Welcome to the Dr. Joe Show. I am so delighted to have you here. It's remarkable that we have to talk about this topic at all, as if there's something wrong with gender affirming care. So where do we want to start?
Well, as I said to Brianna and Alana before we started, what's old is new again.
Yeah.
This is a pattern of harassment that is very familiar to all parties. And it starts with a story called Gamercade.
Yeah, which actually a lot of it happened right here in Massachusetts. So one of the biggest events that really defines the modern political discourse, and more specifically how that discourse has been poisoned, is an event from 2014 known as Gamergate. And to tell the long and short of it, women in the game industry were targeted with a really extreme set of harassment for asking for better working conditions in the field. There was a independent game developer here in Massachusetts by the name of Zoe Quinn. She had some utterly fake allegations made up about her by the fringe parts of the internet. And that kind of exploded with this hate and harassment campaign online. What we didn't know about it at the time was that Gamergate was the playbook for how we argue on the internet. One of the people primarily behind Gamergate was Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon, as we all know, helped Trump get into the White House. And today we've seen this exact same playbook used in this particular instance, the Gamergate playbook being used by the Libs of TikTok account to basically get this propaganda about trans healthcare out there to literally millions of people, put it in these just really sensational, angry, hateful, fake information terms, and get people so riled up that literally you have Boston's Children's Hospital shut down with bomb threats. So, it's the technical word for it is stochastic terrorism. And, the truth is we've been talking about this since 2014, and it's not getting better. And there's a long history of why it's not getting better, which is very specifically because of certain policies that have failed to take this kind of extremist rhetoric seriously.
So, Brianna, what is the game book? I mean, the playbook then of this?
Sure. So what they did to me is, Dr. Joe, if I went through your entire life, I'm sure I could find something to attack you with to make you seem like a terrible person, right?
Even today, absolutely.
It's just no one can withstand this. So the problem is so much of our lives are online today that they can go and, I don't know if you've have written academic papers, or they can look through your academic history or every social media post you've ever made, every tweet you've ever had. How about everything you said on this show? And find little 15-second clips and then have an entire mob to take that and then to turn you into a shadow version of yourself. Like this really dark version that's scheming or lying, or they find stuff to take out of context and to attack you with. And, the truth is they're trying to make the cost of speaking up so high that it's simpler to just stay silent. So what you see on the trans healthcare issue is this exact playbook. You've got doctors out there trying to have just medical discussions about how do we help trans kids? What's the best course of action for healthcare? We don't have a clear course of action on this yet. Professionals are trying to have their own discussion and figure out how to proceed. And their free speech is being impinged upon by this mob. And it's very, very frustrating. I think it fundamentally threatens us as a democratic society.
The problem is that they're very effective propagandists, and they've been at this for a long time. They've got a lot more practice, I would say, than the trans community does, for instance. And they've also got the advantage of, decades of fear mongering about trans people built into our culture, like just baked in. So that's I think that's a factor as well.
And what has that fear consisted of? What do you think?
Well, I mean, think about the villains in half of the slasher flicks in the 80s and 90s. Instead of it started with Psycho. The whole there's this person who is assigned male, but they dress up like a woman and kill people. And for some reason, that just became like a meme within horror movies. Is like, if there's a serial killer, it's not exciting unless they're wearing a skirt, I guess. So it's sort of. I mean, I can't tell you how many times growing up I had people compare me to Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs, and this was the 90s, so that was like a big deal. That was a new movie at the time. So there is this concerted effort to paint trans women, especially the trans community at large, but trans women especially, as somehow predatory and dangerous. And against that backdrop, sort of right-wing, I would say outright fascist propagandists have they've prepped the battlefield for decades in advance.
Yeah, I think that's really, really well said. I mean, it is, trans people are the target du jour. And I think it comes back to, this question. So I didn't grow up in Massachusetts. I grew up in Mississippi. And something I saw in Mississippi was very much this fear that people are coming to take away your culture, right? So in the video game industry, the idea was, women, those feminists, they're coming to take away our culture. And I think what we're seeing in the same way with the trans debate is it's this fear that because you have some people that, need to basically get healthcare to live more authentic lives, I think there's a real fear by certain elements in our society that they're coming to take away a culture or things that, basically a way of living that is very important to some people. So I think we're seeing a really sensationalistic backlash against that. More specifically with libs of TikTok, what is so troubling is the rhetoric. I think that even though I don't agree with them, people that have, they're skeptical of trans civil rights, I think to a certain extent, there's a free speech issue there. What's really concerning about libs of TikTok is they're taking that from a discussion to stochastic terrorism, because they're dehumanizing everyone involved in the discussion. And it's not this doctor is providing healthcare, it's this doctor is disfiguring children. This doctor is, these people are groomers.
This
they're
thing is teaching your child.
Yeah, right. All of that. So they're dehumanizing the other part of the debate that is really pushing it in a way that is leading to violence. And like we saw with the Boston Children's Hospital being shut down with the bomb threat.
And if I can sort of add an addendum to that, it definitely follows the same reactionary pattern of speaking to the fears of lower and middle class white people about they are coming for your children. You know, when they talk about the destruction of culture, it's not just the, well, I mean, it's, they're tearing down your Confederate monuments. They're mutilating your children and making them think it's okay to be queer, which, you know, you just can't do that, you know. It's, you know, my own experience, I grew up in South Carolina in a holiness church. You know, my parents go to church 5 times a week. And, you know, I kind of got disowned because the church was more important than their kid. But I'm very familiar with that line of thinking where there's good and evil, and, you know, it's a very black and white value system. And you find that over time, they do begin to make exceptions for certain things like divorce, you know, like that's okay, that can be excused, but being queer, being trans, that's even worse. You're basically a demon. So they use the same sort of fear mongering, the same, they speak to the same anxieties. It's always about your kids are being led astray. These people are Pied Pipers. They're going to destroy everything you've ever stood for. And they speak to those fears. And it's like you said, the dehumanizing of trans and queer people. It's decades old, centuries at this point, I would say.
It spreads so easy. So I'm happy to report that I was never so far gone as to say like these people aren't human or blah, 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 blah. But I was one of those people who was like, well, the free speech, man. And when I first heard the term stochastic terrorism, I laughed my ass off.
Really?
Yeah. Well, I didn't laugh my ass off, but I was like, SJW, blah, blah.
Right.
Because what did I know? Like I was only surrounded by mostly other young white men with the eternal victim complex.
Right.
Of like, they're coming for me. They hate us because we're white men. It's like, no, they hate us because we're assholes.
Well, I do really want to say there's nothing simple about the free speech debate here. What I think is really hard here, there's a wonderful book by the former deputy of basically our State Department. He wrote a wonderful book on disinformation, and he was talking about how they weaponize our ideals against us. And the same considerations that they're using against us, they would never allow in the opposite direction. So I do want to say, I think it's good for us to have open debate as a general rule. The problem is online, you know, we've really created this monster where, you know, it's not just the harassment, it's the death threats, it's the disinformation, it's when we can't tell right versus up versus down, to the point that, you know, medical professionals can't even get out accurate information about how a vaccine against COVID can help you. So we've built this machine that really excels at just help. We cannot have the national dialogue anymore. So something I believe very strongly is, I think your older self, I would label that as more of an information idealist. You had an idealistic like premise of how free speech should work. I want to be a free speech realist. And my idea of how free speech works is we've got to think about how free speech can be shut down. We have to think about how bots can weaponize these things that we've built to make it impossible to get accurate information out to people. We have to take a really realistic look at what we built and always have that highest principle in our mind of helping us have a discussion to be able to educate ourselves and make decisions as a democracy. That's what I think we need to do.
And that's where we have to pay attention to material reality. You know,
yeah, 100%.
Excited when I start hearing about that. But no, the thing is, the reality is that you can't really engage in open debate with some of these folks because they're being disingenuous. Like they've already planted their ideological flag and nothing you say will sway them. And they're not engaging in good faith discussion. They're not going to listen to anything you say. and they're going to throw whatever they can at the wall to see what sticks. And ultimately, online debate, as it were, mostly just comes down to it always inevitably it just becomes harassment, because they've found that with enough sort of shouting you down, with enough harassment, if they can dogpile you enough, then they win, and that's it. And that's why, I just don't even engage in those discussions anymore most of the time, unless I just I'm feeling froggy. Like I can't tell you how many death threats I got after my fight. I still get them. Like, it's just every once in a while, like I'll check my notifications and someone will have gone down and commented on a dozen of my photos, calling me a man and saying that I'm disgusting, destroying women's sports and blah, blah, blah. And I'm a coward that won't fight men. Like, it's all the same shit over and over again.
Yeah.
And
like Joe Rogan dedicated like an hour and a half just bitching about trans people in sports, but like specifically about you and your fight.
It's funny because I'd heard he hadn't actually mentioned me specifically. I know he did that about Fallon back in like 2014, but I'd heard he'd not actually mentioned me specifically. And then I saw a headline saying that he actually supported me competing because I was open about being trans, and that's a whole other can of worms. But
can I come back to this stochastic terrorism? Some of our listeners may not know what that is. So, Brianna, would you like to start with that definition?
Sure. Stochastic terrorism is, how can I put this? It's this theory that if you're trying to track down terrorism, there's a way to create it with these hate mobs or just overall anger, and then you cannot predict where it is going to erupt. So if you want to think about it in a more traditional way, like ISIS might put out a ton of propaganda, and then you don't know when they're going to have a suicide bombing or something like that, right? That's stochastic terrorism. You can kind of trace it back to, these recruitment websites. In that same way, a lot of the fringe elements in American politics, unfortunately, are literally copying that stochastic terrorism model. We see this with, Kiwi Farms, 8chan. 8chan's a great example of stochastic terrorism. This was created during Gamercade. You had people come in, they are red pill stuff. I hate women. Let's dox women. Let's talk about who we hate. Let's talk about who needs to be killed. And then that is directly tied to the Christchurch massacre in New Zealand. Like, there's a direct line between 8chan kind of creating this community where people can talk about how much they hate Muslims, and then one of their members that decides to go and shoot up a mosque and slaughter 49 Muslims. So it's this theory of terrorism that you have to kind of, you can't predict where these communities of hate are kind of going to erupt violently, if that makes sense.
And it's a very effective model because it's terrorism by word rather than deed. Like, someone doesn't have to actually organize a terrorist operation, a terrorist plot. All they have to do is put out the call to action, knowing that these communities are already galvanized and primed to react.
And one of the reasons I'm so pissed about things like Boston Children's Hospital is that I've noticed the pattern, like retroactively, that the attempt to start the campaign at stochastic terrorism, it started in terms like cultural Marxism.
Yeah.
Which people are sick of Nazi analogies. This is what the Nazis did with a term called Judeo-Bolshevism, which, who knows, might have even worked here. Now it's woke. And I'm not saying that everyone who uses the term woke as a pejorative is a Nazi, but it's so convenient. It's the way to hide, like, calling someone an N-word lover. It's like, you're woke.
Yeah, it's I feel like a lot of this is because of sort of a lack of political will on the left, or, well, not even on the left, but for liberals, which I don't know if your audience agrees with me, but I would say there is a difference between a liberal and a leftist. And there's sort of been this, growing up, looking in history books, public education, the idea that there was this sort of enlightened centrist view where you could, bring everyone to the table. But at some point, you have to recognize that some folks only want to burn the table. They want to smash it up. They don't want to take part in it. And I think because of that that fence walking, that lack of political will, we've been unable to acknowledge where these ideas are coming from. And I know everybody complains about using the word Nazi, using the word fascist, but this is what these ideals are. One of the greatest sins, I think, in my history books growing up was that they showed us the Nazi book burnings. They didn't tell us what books they were burning. Those books were about queer identity. Those books were about trans identity. And that just wasn't discussed. They don't tell you that when the concentration camps were liberated, queer people were put back in. And these ideas just persist because we have not been honest with ourselves about the history. So when we say like these ideas are fascist, they are Nazi, it's because they are. I mean, and even then, like Hitler himself said he was inspired by the way the United States treated Black people and Indigenous people. So, I mean, this is just a long thread going back and back, and we just, due to a lack of political will on the left, or maybe because of the political will on the right, this the waters have been muddied and this history has been obfuscated. And as a result, we're dealing with the same things in 2022 that we were dealing with in 1922.
And I'll say, our listeners are very, very smart. And they know that when we're talking about politics, we're not singling any of them out. I like this podcast called the West Wing Thing by this man, Dave Anthony, who is very into like politics and, again, the rise of fascism. But he'll pause every now and then and say, like, we're not talking about voters specifically. It's like, because we don't know you, the listener, like personally. We're not Santa. So when we're talking about things like left, right, Nazi, fascist, centrist, we're talking about like the very concepts in there, the way they're put in practice, because I mean, we can't ignore it. Like I have the luxury for most of my life of like saying like, this doesn't matter, but it does. I'm sorry.
100%. Can I talk a little bit more concretely about some solutions to all of this that I have been advocating since 2014? One of the biggest calls I had during Gamergate was with the Obama White House. This was when Eric Holder was our Attorney General. And I was trying to get them, Catherine Clark, our Congresswoman here in Massachusetts, was working with me and trying to get the FBI to take some of these threats on my life seriously and prosecute them. And the truth is the Eric Holder Justice Department declined to prosecute this slam dunk case of death threats, rape threats, extremely credible, extremely direct, knowing who was behind them. They declined to prosecute this. And that sent a very terrifying message that we saw continuing through like the Trump presidency and the run up to that, and now on to libs of TikTok today. So what I want to see, this is not a left versus right thing I'm talking about. I'm talking a law enforcement response to this. Very often these cases happen across state lines. Very rarely is someone sending me a death threat or a rape threat going to live right here in Massachusetts. So Massachusetts prosecutors can get them and go, bring a case against them. They usually live in some other state. So that makes the FBI the appropriate person to prosecute this. Danielle Citron did a study on this and found out of 30,000 cases they identified for their study of credible threats to kill someone online, police only prosecuted about 6 of them, and all of them were cases of that against police officers. So what I want to see happen from a concrete policy point of view is I want to see parts of the FBI, I want to see us fund a very specific division to prosecute these high profile cases of trying to threaten to murder people across the internet, which is a crime. Because I think that introduces consequences into the situation. And I think that will make people think twice before using this, basically having what is fun for them by basically hunting someone and causing them psychological damage. That's step one. 2, I would like to see Nancy Pelosi make Congresswoman Catherine Clark's bill making swatting a federal crime, I would like to see her bring that to the floor. This is something the right and the left 100% should agree on. Swatting is when you basically threaten, you tell someone there's an incident at someone's house, they need to send an armed SWAT team. They show up, they bust in with guns, and sometimes people get killed. Catherine Clark wants to make that a federal crime. This wastes police resources, and it also puts the people being swatted in danger. So we need to do both of those things today. The third one is I want to see social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook hold accounts like Libs of TikTok to higher standards. You know, that account has been reported and suspended multiple times. It's obvious it's acting in bad faith. They're not willing to take the political hit and say, you know what, you're encouraging violence. We don't want to have you on our platform. They have a responsibility. Like the moment that our hospitals in Massachusetts are being shut down is the moment they don't get to keep having free speech on that platform, I think. So, you know, I think those 3 steps would do a lot to cool down the debate and help us have a conversation that's based in fact.
I think those would be really great steps, but I hate to be cynical here, but I don't think it's really possible for a number of reasons. And one of those is that, you know, I talked about political will. I would say a big part of the reason that like the credible threats against you weren't taken seriously or investigated, and the only ones that do get taken seriously are the ones against cops, is because law enforcement, including the FBI, is kind of full of these right-wing ideas and ideologies. I mean, we know who gets gunned down disproportionately by police in the United States. And granted, like numbers wise, like absolute numbers, sure, maybe more white people get killed than black people, but that's because it's literally like a majority of the population. But black folks statistically get killed more often by police than white people do. And the thing is, like, when it comes to taking care of trans people, taking care of black people, taking threats against minorities seriously, there's no incentive because a lot of these police officers agree with the points that these stochastic terrorists are making. You know, I've been involved in a lot of protests in Portland in the past few years, and I will say, every time you go to one, whenever there's a line of riot cops, they always have their backs to the Nazis. They always are facing towards the leftist protesters, and this has been a pattern the whole 6 years. Even before we had Patriot Prayer and Joey Gibson organizing weekly rallies, before we had fascists from Alaska and Texas flying into these rallies, the pattern still remained the same. There was one where, I don't know if you guys heard about this a few years ago, there was a triple murder on the Max train.
The stabbing, right?
Double murder. Yeah, the Max train stabbing. There were 2 people killed there, and a friend of mine was stabbed in the neck. And the guy who did it, Jeremy Christian, was at one of these rallies a week or 2 before I was there, and he was walking around Sieg Heiling with an American flag on his back. And, you know, this guy was a known threat. And at this rally, there were over 150 of these right-wing fascists out here doing this demonstration. And the opposition to them was about a dozen kids dressed as clowns, just trying to sort of mock them. And there was a line of riot cops in front of these fascists facing towards these kids dressed as clowns, pushing them out of the way so these fascists could march. And that's been the pattern the whole time.
So I'd be remiss if I didn't speak on behalf of at least one of the listeners. Are you Antifa?
That question is kind of loaded. Anyone who has anti-fascist ideals, as you know, a broad category, can be called Antifa, sure. But the idea that like there's some shadowy cabal of you know, this militant organization, a singular militant organization, you know, I mean, I have anti-fascist ideals, I will say that. But the thing is, like, again, when we talk about these concrete solutions, these concrete steps that could be taken, the capitalists that run Twitter don't care about minorities. They care about the dollar. And if they're generating a ton of outrage, like that outrage is bringing in money, they're going to keep allowing that outrage to happen regardless of the human cost. And
I have to say, I think you're falling into black or white thinking, though.
You know, I understand.
If I could just say, I know so many people that work at Twitter on the trust and safety team. They're not
I know a few of them too.
These are,
I know a few of them too. But those are the workers. Those are not the CEO.
I think there's good work being done by people at Twitter. And I think I've also seen, I personally worked with a lot of law enforcement that takes this stuff extremely seriously, particularly prosecutors. I think they're asking for tools to do their job better. And I think we would be well served to give them those tools.
There are some good cops, but systemically, the political will is not there.
Mhm.
And that's the problem. These systems have to change. Individual cops, individual programs are not going to do it.
It's just very important that people know what they're talking about, because there's a concept called the Overton Window, which is beginning and end of the range of acceptable thought. And it's been getting narrower and narrower, it feels, over the years, where it's like, ooh, can't say that. And to talk about like things like law enforcement reform or trans activism in general, you're one of them if you start talking like that. And it's like, nope, not
sadly, I'm one of them.
Yeah. And we need to understand, we need to know the concepts we're talking about if we're going to have a discussion. And I don't think people are doing that.
Well, and again, this is my very cynical take here as someone who worked in the special operations community and saw the personalities that are there. And having trained at a lot of the same facilities and in the same programs as law enforcement personnel that are on SWAT teams, I know where their politics lie.
Yeah.
And for every good cop trying to do something for queer and trans people, or every good cop trying to push back against racism on the force, there are a dozen that are the exact opposite. I mean, you can, I'll encourage folks to Google Portland Nazi cop. Portland, Oregon, where I live now, you know, which a lot of people have this idea that it's a bastion of liberalism and left-wing thought. People forget Oregon was founded as a white supremacist state, and black people, it was like a sundown state. If you're familiar with sundown towns, it was a sundown state. And a few years ago, there was a cop on the Portland police force he got fired for erecting shrines to dead Nazi soldiers in public parks. And then he sued the city and got his job back. And in 2019, he retired as the head of Vice. And this man made no secret of his Nazi ties. So
we have another frequent guest that you would get along with very well. He was an 8-year Army veteran who trained alongside people who are now with Blackwater. So he knows.
Yeah, I used to train at Blackwater.
Oh,
yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
So he knows the same thing I know. Like, we know what their politics are. Like, while, you know, it's like Army regulations will say, oh, you can't go on record saying anything that's problematic, but like everyone's throwing around the F slur, everyone's being openly racist. I mean, the special operations community is overwhelmingly white. Like by a vast margin. And when you look at like the demographics of the Army in general, there are a lot more minorities, but in the elite, you know, in the special forces, it's mostly white dudes.
I think I hope that this can just be a respectful disagreement here. And this is my bias. I'm not cynical. I agree with every problem you're talking about here. I think that sometimes on the left, we have a tendency to take what I call the doomer pill, like to think like everything is terrible and we can't change any of these systems unless we do what we call an engineering, which is a boil the ocean strategy, which is do something that's so big, we're going to reinvent all the law enforcement in the entire United States. And I agree with you. You've identified a core problem here. But I think that you can't get cynical and tell yourself like, oh, this is irredeemable. Oh, nothing can be done here. I really do believe if you were to go fund, because we're talking about the Boston situation here, I do think if you were to pass Catherine Clark's bill and then give the FBI this tool to then go and do like back IP traces and find out who's swatting people and give them the tools to act in this situation, I think that would be a net positive. Now, would a department like this be used like for the cases they found most convenient, like cops and things like that? I don't know if I agree with that. I think that generally speaking, they respond to a lot of political pressures. So I think things that were high profile, that were in the media, I think this would give them tools to go solve this. So do I think it's going to be perfect? No, but I at my core am an engineer. And I think when you've got, I think we don't have one 100% solution. I think we have like 101% solutions. And that's just the way I'm built to think, how can we improve the system?
I understand that. And I would just remind you that, internal memorandums from the FBI and from other federal agencies have found that, the largest internal terrorist threat in the United States is from white identity extremism. It's from white supremacists. But instead of addressing that, they don't put resources towards that. Instead, they invented a new category of Black identity extremists and have been pursuing that avenue. Just a reminder.
I'm aware, and we don't disagree on the problem. We just have a disagreement on what the tactics are. What I'm hearing from you is more of these institutions are irredeemable. And I'm like, let's look at these institutions, identify problems like the ones you're saying, and see how we can make that better. That's my approach to that.
So let me just jump in here, because Brianna, you said what I am hearing, which is such an important phrase. Is that what you are saying? What Brianna is hearing? What do you think?
I mean, that's an interesting question. I don't subscribe to the belief that, we can just abolish police and crime will magically go away. But I also very much recognize that the police don't protect us. They don't protect us. They don't protect our communities. Again, Brianna will probably think I'm just having a lot of black and white thinking here. And I've been accused of that by my therapist before. PTSD, it's a thing. But I don't think we can look at the data and think that the police are particularly redeemable. The phrase is, a bad apple spoils the bunch, not, one bad apple, you just get rid of it, because it's all bad apples. It's all bad apples. Like one good apple doesn't make the bucket of rot, fix itself. I do think police as they are now in the United States are to an extent irredeemable. That system is irredeemable. I think I think we do need some sort of law enforcement, but that said, the system that we have right now and the sort of foundations it's built on, it needs an overhaul, a complete overhaul. And I don't have a solution for how we do that because it's so entrenched. But, I don't think a program here and there is going to fix anything, because that's kind of how we got where we are now. We put a little money towards this program, we put a little money towards that program, and we tell ourselves we've done something and we expect it to get better. But the fact of the matter is things don't get better unless we agitate for it constantly and regularly. This is one of the critiques I have of the sort of centrist viewpoint, the enlightened centrist viewpoint, is that bad ideas and bad people just die out over time. The arc of history tends towards justice. I don't agree with that. I don't think that's true. I think we have to fight for every advance we get, and we have to fight every step of the way. And that work never ends. It won't end in my lifetime.
Here's, the I am approach to this, if you don't mind. Seeing as though it's my show, so I'm just going to anyway. So, but here's the idea. I'll just tell you a story. When I was covering an inpatient psych unit, for another colleague. And there's what's called a code red. Code red means there's a dangerous situation, an imminently dangerous situation on a locked inpatient psychiatric ward. And as the person on call and the only physician in the building at that time, I go there. And there is a gentleman who is enraged, absolutely enraged. Don't know why, but they are enraged, and people are scared by this rage. And I go into this room, and this man says to me, "You're just going to inject me, right? You're here to inject me with antipsychotic." And I said to him, "Are you a lumper?" He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, you've just lumped me in with every other psychiatrist you probably met. So are you a lumper?" And he said, "Well, what do you mean?" I said, "You don't know me. I'm just interested. Why are you so pissed off? What's going on that you're so pissed off? I mean, if you want an injection, we can give you an injection. If you want to take a medicine by mouth, we can do that. But why are you so angry? I'm not going to lump you in with all the other psychotic patients, because you're not. You're unique." And I think that we run the risk as human beings of just doing this. We are still primitive tribal individuals. We look to be a member of a group. And what the I am is saying is, we're one group. It's called humanity. We all are doing this. So now, how do I step back and wonder, why is that police officer doing this? Why is this system doing this? Why are these members doing this? And just as the two of you, the four of us, are having a dialogue, a discussion, we don't have to agree. But that doesn't mean we don't respect each other's point of view. That's, for me, that's the key. Why are these people doing what they're doing? What is their motivation? And the only way I'm going to find out is by talking with them. How do we do that? How do I step back enough to be able to project peace so that somebody else knows I'm not going to activate my mirror neurons? So you guys know about mirror neurons? Mirror neurons, right? We will mirror what other people think or feel. But once we know about those, we can step back, do something different, and activate their mirror neurons in a different way. So these are critical discussions to have. But we also run the risk of just doing the same thing. How do we step back?
I think a similar thing, but I think it's putting the cart before the horse to say, let's just talk to them, because the reason people become like anti-trans or like extremists is because it fills the need for a community. And it's very easy. When you're, a socially awkward teenager, you can immediately fall in love with a group of friends who are just like you. You can, game together, you can talk to each other, and you can hate on the same thing. I don't know how you undo years of that by asking them what they're pissed about. And it's another thing when they're there to kill you.
Well, and as a caveat to that as well, I would point out that they know this. Like, they know that we are operating in good faith, that we're going to ask them what they're angry about. And they would then use that as an excuse to start talking about white genocide and how the Jews are controlling the media and the trans people are converting your kids. And they'll use that as the excuse to go ahead and start spouting their propaganda. But whenever you try to counter it, they will just shout you down because they're not good faith actors. And I guess that's where, like, in an ideal situation, in a perfect world, I would love to be able to like sit down and reason with these folks. But the material reality of it is that when someone tells me that they're my enemy and they want me dead, I take them at their word. And frankly, like a lot of these folks, like maybe they can be reasoned with individually if you have enough time. Maybe if I were able to spend months or years dealing with this person on an individual basis, I could find out what makes them tick and, sort of allay their fears and make them understand who I am and how I'm not trying to destroy their way of life or whatever. But I don't have that kind of time. They don't have that kind of time. And, speaking from experience, they're there to fight. And at that point, I think it becomes a practical matter of I have to protect myself. I have to, so I'm not going to engage in the debate, and the onus should not be on queer folks, on Black folks, on immigrants, on Muslims to defend their existence. I think when someone tells you that they are ideologically opposed to your life, you can take them at their word. And I don't really think engaging with them in any sort of civil discourse, the civility is not there from the beginning. When they're starting from, my position is that you should not be allowed to live, I don't think you need to be civil with that person.
And Dr. Joe, your exchange took place in a psychiatric ward. So there was a guarantee of safety.
A power dynamic involved.
So I think it's a very sound thing to want to have that discussion. But first things first, I would say. It's like we need a stronger guarantee of people's safety.
I think that for you personally, I think for you in that moment, it's not your job to make those people feel heard or coddle their feelings. That's not your mission objective. Your mission objective is to be safe and to thrive. And we ask enough of trans people in this society, and someone that's dealing with, PTSD or something from online abuse. I certainly understand that. That's not your problem. That said, as a society, as an entire country, we have to reckon with the fact that we have created an entire generation of lost boys. We're creating a lot of really, really dangerous individuals, which is why this gun violence is so terrible in this country. I met a lot of Gamercaders when I went and toured colleges all around this country. And before I did that, I had this idea in my mind that these were monsters or 30-year-old men that lived in their mom's basement. Like I had all these stereotypes of who was sending me death threats. And when I started going to colleges, I realized I met them. And I realized these were really deeply under-socialized, desperately lonely young men that just frankly had no interaction with women whatsoever. And I think we've created an entire generation of young men that are looking desperately for a father figure, which is why they fall into being led by Joe Rogan or Donald Trump or, any of these
Jordan Peterson.
Jordan Peterson, these people that tap in and kind of lead them. So I don't think it's your mission objective. I think it's fine for you as an individual to say, this is not my problem. But I think for us as a country, we do have to have a compassionate and holistic look at this problem that we've got and figure out how to lead these young boys. Before the show, we were both talking about how much we love Hassan over on Twitch. Yeah, this is somebody I think that is a very, very strong male role model. He's pro-trans. He has, politics that are generally inclusive, and he's out there modeling masculinity in a way feminists just simply cannot. I think that's hugely positive. So I think what we need as a society is more Hassans and more people out there to kind of guide young men along and just put them on a healthier path.
Well, I mean, I definitely agree with that. But I would say the problem is older than just this generation.
Yeah.
We, in America specifically, and I would say more broadly, like in the West, Western culture, the idea of masculinity is inherently wrapped up in violence and domination. We don't offer an alternative. We tell boys and men that their value lies in their capacity for violence and their capacity for overpowering someone else. Like, I grew up in the 80s and 90s. I saw the Rambo movies. There's a reason that before I transitioned, when I was trying to be a man the way you're supposed to be a man, I joined the army. I went special forces, because these were the models for masculinity that were put in front of me. And it was always, like, every piece of it, I thought I was, pre-transition, we'll say late 90s, early 2000s, like, I thought I was entirely alone. And I would sit here and I'd read these books that, I didn't think that men thought the way I thought, but like, I would try to convince myself, like, well, this book says that this is what I have to be, so I'm going to do this thing. But now, like, I read some of the things that a lot of these, alt-right men write, and a lot of these incels and gamergaters and like all these people that have taken this sort of the doomer pilled political line where they just, they're all jokerfied, like they've decided that this system is not built for them, even though like history shows otherwise, and their anger is sort of misdirected. But the point is, like, I've come to realize that they all say the same things. They've read the same media. It's cultural. It's not a thing that we can just fix overnight. And a lot of it, we are putting the onus on sort of I would say on the people that are being more directly impacted, being oppressed, for lack of a better word. We're telling women that they have to fix these men. We're telling queer people that they have to just be patient enough to explain why they should be allowed to exist. And the unfortunate fact is that those things are not going to change unless we actually do that. And it is extremely unjust that we're put in that position in the first place.
And to just get back to just the idea of Boston Children's Hospital and people very loudly not understanding. So I'm on the autism spectrum, and I did an interview for a documentary on autism, and I was asked about intersectionality. And so many people cringe at the words, like, oh, this was a social. Well, all it means is realizing that we all have our own stuff going on. So autism wasn't even written down in the DSM until like the late 1900s. And for a long time, even after that, people acted like it didn't exist. It's like, these kids are just misbehaving. ADHD, these kids are just misbehaving. It doesn't actually exist. You're making it up. On a lighter note, ASMR, that tingly feeling people get in their heads. Everyone who had it thought that they were alone. Didn't exist, made it up. So why is it so hard to imagine that someone isn't comfortable with the role they were assigned at birth? Why is that so hard to wrap your head around?
Well, that's the thing. They do acknowledge it. They do believe it. This is my personal take. They know that these folks exist. The evidence is in front of them, but it comes back to it's the same cultural background, the same cultural backdrop. It's like, well, these kids with ADHD and autism, just beat them. Just beat them. Eventually, they'll start acting right. And the same thing was applied to queer and trans people. Like, I grew up in a time and place where being queer or trans was not okay. I was sent to reparative therapy. I think, if anything, like, I'm an example of how that stuff doesn't work. I did all the man things, and I did them better than most men. And it still didn't change anything. You couldn't beat the woman out of me. And I think, regardless of whether it's successful or not, the idea that they have is that they can just force people to sort of adapt to the system that is in place, that you can force people to, I can't even think of the word right now, but to integrate into these systems,
We have a remarkable ability to dehumanize each other.
Yes.
Human beings. But what's interesting is, I think it takes that dehumanization to then engage and enact that anger and violence. I think human beings are much more protective of each other than we want to give each other credit for. And the only way, I really believe this, the only way we can really hurt somebody else is to say they're not human and dehumanize them. That's really interesting, because we can reframe that and say, that's actually kind of encouraging. As soon as we start seeing each other as human, we will be less likely to want to hurt each other. That's one of the big challenges. How do we do that? And that's part of the discussion. I'm an optimist as well, hopefully a little bit of a realist here and there, but I do have faith, because we have evolved a new part of our brain, right? We have the limbic system, which is the ancient, primitive, emotional, irrational part of the brain. That's a lot of what we're talking about. But we have a new part, the prefrontal cortex, the ability to have rational thought, to see a problem, execute a plan, and anticipate what will happen next. We can anticipate what will happen next if we remain limbic. We will destroy ourselves. There'll be one group that maybe will destroy another group, but ultimately, we will dilute the diversity that has made us human. And that's where we need to get back to. It's in the diversity that we have the strength to survive, that we have the strength to adapt. How do we encourage that diversity in each other? And that's something that I believe in. Look, we are not that far removed from ancient ancestors. And so, when you talk about this male image of dominance and aggression, it's absolutely true. But there were reasons for that many, many millions of years ago that may not apply now. We just have to be able to get there before we destroy ourselves. And I think we can. I really do.
I absolutely agree with you on the idea of diversity being our strength. But I would like to pose a question. When you talk about the limbic system being the sort of driver of this reactionary, the reaction and the violence, how do you square that circle when it comes to looking at projects like the Holocaust? Because, when you had Nazis in power, it wasn't just them being reactive. It took the prefrontal cortex. It took all of that logic and planning to organize these death camps.
Agreed.
It was downright machinistic.
Right. So one of the roles I have is I work a lot with folks with substance use issues. And there's a really interesting study that looked at the dopamine levels in a person. So all drugs and alcohol force the brain to make dopamine. That's an ancient chemical of pleasure, has other functions in our world and our body, but it is a very selfish chemical. When you get triggered, like, I don't know, does the name Pavlov ring a bell? Sorry, I know it's a bad joke, thank you. But the condition, right, exactly, does it ring a bell? So the conditioned response, you get triggered. There's a little blip of dopamine that goes up. It's the teaser. And then it's basically saying to your brain, there's something good over there, go get that. Then when you look, the dopamine levels dip down below baseline, slowly increase until you get the drug. It's that moment after the trigger that's critical, because the limbic system doesn't plan, just like what you're saying. The limbic system has to take control of the prefrontal cortex to make that plan. So there will always be a moment for you to make another plan in substance world. There will always be that moment to be reflective instead of reflexive. to wonder instead of worry. They will always be. It's just the way the brain works. So you're absolutely right. There was a lot of limbic response, and then the planning happened to enact that limbic response. But the limbic doesn't plan. It's impulsive. Does things right then. So yeah, how do we capture that moment? The only way to do it is to recognize it's happening.
Yeah. I just celebrated 20 years sober from rehab. I had to go there for polyaddictive substance abuse. That really rings true to me. Everything you just said.
Yeah, and we congratulate folks on their sobriety.
Yeah,
but it's also like, addiction is not about morality; it's about mortality. It's just the way the brain works, and you've been able to take your brain and say, I'm gonna shift to my prefrontal. How many times have you done something limbically, impulsively, and slapped your forehead as if trying to jumpstart your prefrontal cortex? What was I thinking? That's what we do. And that's what we need to do as a society, as a world, because we know what will happen next. I truly believe we are on the cusp of an evolutionary leap. We just have to survive long enough to get there.
Here's
right
hoping.
there.
That's
Here's
a tall
hoping.
order.
It is, especially from a short Jewish guy. So, but we can do this, but not alone. But the Tom wanted to have this discussion, and I'm so grateful for it, because we are faced with this insidious, creeping darkness. We are. But once we can see it, how do you see something in the dark? You don't. You got to throw light on it, and that's what we need to do.
And that's
if I could just venture an opinion, I think that as we're developing the Gamergate television show, something that's really important to me is I've turned this down a lot because it kind of portrays the other people as evil or just all. I've turned it down when they've wanted to tell it as kind of a feminist horror story. I do think on the left, all too often, we fall into we're not going to get anywhere with this continued, the other person's evil, just continuing to hammer each other. We've got to start building coalitions and start moving in a unified direction. Something I think that's so frustrating about the TERF movement is you've got real threats to women's bodily autonomy going on in the United States right now. We're talking about freaking trans people. That's the big threat when you've got half the states in this country. We've got to start thinking more critically about what the mission objective is and what we're fighting for, rather than who the villain or the target of the week is. And I think we need serious strategic people on the left that are focused on coalition building, because there's no successful movement in our country that hasn't involved bringing people together that don't agree on everything and trying to move in the same direction on critical things. So I very much feel like that is the way forward.
Alana,
In response to both Brianna and Dr. Joe, I would say that's where we have a lot of hard work ahead of us, in that we have to actually acknowledge the things that have happened. We have to acknowledge the evil that does exist. And I'm not going to say, I don't think people are evil, but actions are, and I feel like we can't proceed with this project until we acknowledge sort of the sins of our fathers, the sins of our past. We can't move forward as this shining beacon, this city on the hill, like Ronald Reagan used to be so fond of saying, if we don't acknowledge that it's built on a foundation of murder. You look at the United States, and indigenous genocide is what this country is built on. This country was built by the hands of slaves on the bones of indigenous people. And we can't just go forward and be good people until we openly acknowledge those facts and wrestle with them and come out on top, and that's why when it comes to coalition building, we have to acknowledge the ways in which we've betrayed each other. We have to acknowledge the ways in which we're not coming at it from a genuine position, like when it comes to TERFs, for instance, right? Look at the folks that they are sort of in bed with, like Matt Walsh. This guy's like an open theocratic, self-described theocratic fascist, but TERFs, supposedly feminists, are on his side because he's going after trans people. And that's where you have to sort of, the second wave feminist movement, which is where a lot of, like TERF ideology comes from, is that old second wave feminist movement. It threw away Black folks. It threw away trans folks. It was a white feminist movement. And that's the kind of history that we have to acknowledge if we ever want to move forward. You can't just say, well, if someone says they're a feminist, well, they're definitely on my side, and I wish we could do that. But that's the problem. The waters have been muddied, and that's the way fascism works. That's the way TERFs are operating. It's the same sort of, I'm going to take my ideology and I'm going to wrap it in the language of your ideology. And that's how I'm going to recruit. So when it comes to coalition building and when it comes to sort of shining a light on things, we have to acknowledge we have to actually acknowledge history, the real history, what's actually happened. And that's the starting point.
I think you can do that. I do think on the left, we tend to focus on our differences a lot more than what brings us together. And that's my message, is that we need to, something I've really learned, and one of the reasons, like during Gamergate, I would describe myself as more of an activist. Today, I would describe myself as more of a political professional, because it's a different set of skills. It's fundraising. It's working with, it is working with the FEC, which there are a ton of regulations there, is donating money to progressive candidates that support those things that both you and I very strongly agree on, like reforming the police, right? It's supporting, it's the bread and butter electoral politics of how you make that happen. And the people on the left that I respect the most personally, this is just for me, are the ones that naturally bring people together to celebrate those common goals. I agree with you. TERFs are too far gone. Even as we're recording this, J.K. Rowling is basically likening trans women to rapists on Twitter. Disgusting. She's gone. You can't save her, and you can't save the Matt Walshes or the people that are in that movement. But I do think that you can take that great middle out there and say, like, look, this is what's under attack. You're never going to find a trans woman that is against abortion ever, right? All women are under attack right now. Trans women, cis women, trans men that can get pregnant. All women are under attack right now. We need to focus on what brings us together and accomplish those political goals and get serious about showing up and voting. I think that's how you stay away from despair, because it's so easy to feel despair in this moment. Like, all of us have a responsibility to do what we can. And it's not just sitting around admiring the problem. I agree with everything you're saying, but we have to find the things that we can do that make that 1% change. And we need to take personal agency. We have the power. This is when you say, look, this system is broken, this system is broken, this system is broken. I agree with you, but you're also giving that system all your power if you're not taking the agency in yourself, let's go change it. And I want to take that power back for myself and feel responsibility to do what I can.
Well, I absolutely believe we need to be empowering ourselves to change these systems. However, I am skeptical of being able to do it at the ballot box, at least not entirely. I'm not one of those people that's going to say, don't vote, it doesn't matter. It absolutely does. But that said, voting is not enough. It has to be a lot more than just voting.
They count on winning, and then that's it.
So,
Brianna, you were even talking about, before the show got started, this sort of the critiques you had of the Democratic Party politics that you saw behind the
yeah.
scenes.
Oh,
And,
it's terrible.
I mean, that's part of the problem when it becomes like this sort of soulless numbers game of like, well, we're going to put this much money towards this thing, and you know, like it's how, again, I talk about material analysis a lot. Look at some of the mistakes the Democratic Party's made, running Hillary Clinton as the presidential candidate the first time after decades of a right-wing smear campaign against the Clintons.
Sure.
That was just, I mean, I couldn't tell you how many times when I was on a Special Forces ODA, I heard Nancy Pelosi's name spat with venom.
Sure.
I was not politically engaged. I like, full disclosure, when I was in the Army, I was not political at all. I was just going with the flow. But I heard Nancy Pelosi and Hillary Clinton's names just like shit on so many times. And
I think there are right reasons to shit on them. But.
There absolutely are reasons to, but those were not the reasons that were. The thing is, it's like, yeah, I'm just talking about like the sort of the actualities, the material conditions, material analysis here. The Democratic Party was not in touch with this situation on the ground, you know,
Sure.
and picking Hillary Clinton as the candidate was pretty much the worst thing they could have done. And that's how we ended up with Donald Trump.
Sure.
You know?
I think you have to vote, but then you also, so let's look at a very concrete example, the student loan debt thing. I and a ton of other people have been out there. I voted for Joe Biden. I helped like arrange fundraising for Joe Biden. I did everything I could. He was not my first choice. He was like my 20th choice, right? I would have taken Warren or Bernie or any number of people before him, but he got the nomination and we needed to beat Trump. So I didn't just vote and say, okay, I'm done. I'll see y'all again in 4 years. We stayed on him. And there's all this work behind the scenes of cranking up the pressure on that administration to take student loan forgiveness seriously. You know,
and if you hadn't, he wouldn't have acted.
You're absolutely right.
And
so this is what I'm saying. Stay engaged and don't just like have this bedtime story idea of democracy, right? We had a policy that we specifically wanted. It wasn't as much as I wanted, but it was better than, like, a lot of people are going to benefit from that specific policy. So stay on it, stay engaged. Don't give them your power. Here's a concrete example of us taking back our power, putting pressure, working through the system and getting a good result. We can do that in so many places.
But we have to work outside that system as well.
To a point, I agree. Yeah.
And we have to understand that, like, so again, back to we're not shitting on voters. We have to understand that we can work together with everyone. Like, if I could just snap my fingers and wish granted, like, I drop left, right, because most people fall like left of center, believe it or not, in the United States. Like, they just don't know it. Like, if you ask them like about things like student loan forgiveness or a single payer healthcare, like these things that are labeled left, but people are like, it's a scary word. It's a very scary word where it's like, oh, like Stalin, but we don't have to be left versus right. We can be top down.
Yeah, I agree with that.
There's nothing wrong with anger. It's what you do with it that's important.
Yeah.
And it's how you use it. Anger is about change. We get angry when we want somebody to do something different. Start doing something, stop doing something.
Anger is more useful than despair.
Yes.
That's my favorite line from Terminator.
Powerful. Yes. Yes. But it's not the same as aggression. Aggression is the enactment of anger in a way that hurts. But anger, the most important social changes have occurred because of anger. It's how you use that anger. That's really critical in this, because we have a brain that can very quickly become limbic. And, you know, one of my phrases, keep it frontal, don't go limbic, right? So that we can use this brain of ours. Also, about police reform, I don't think I want to reform it. I want to completely redo it. I mean, right? Why would we want to reform the same thing? The words that we use are so important. We don't realize how influenced we are by words. In my field, in psychiatry, I am trying to get people to stop using the word disorder because it separates people. Bipolar disorder, substance use disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder, as if you're responding to the stress of trauma wrong.
Gender identity disorder.
Right, exactly, right? Disorder. So these words are critical the way we use them. But in the town I live in, we have a person who is the head of our police force, and he doesn't use the word force. Right? It's not a police force. It's a community policing. And you want to talk with somebody who's got the right way of doing it, a way that makes people feel they are part of the community, come and talk with our chief of police. I'm serious. He's absolutely remarkable. And I just wish that we could, elevate him so that he could teach everyone how to do this. But we're in this world where we have so much division. And part of that has to do also with the way our brains are. We keep attributing morality to it. And so, if we can take responsibility for what we have done without being blamed, that's different. Responsibility is empowering. Blame is shaming. But we have done some terrible things for which we have to be responsible. But as soon as somebody blames you for it, that person's gonna put up a resistance. So I am absolutely not disagreeing with anything anyone's saying here. It's the messaging of it. It's the optics of it. It's how we get it done so that another person doesn't feel devalued just the way we have.
So how do you ask for accountability without placing blame? How do you tell a Black mother whose son's been killed by the cops that she has to be calm and reasonable and not put pressure on the cop that pulled the trigger?
Well, that's not what I'm saying at all. No, that cop who pulled the trigger is held responsible for it.
But they're not.
But they must be. I agree with you. They're not. That's one of the shifts that we have to make. I agree with you. But our brains are designed in such a way that as soon as you feel blamed, you are going to put up a defensive wall. You're going to put up resistance, and nothing happens after that.
Because you think that, like, oh, you hate me because I'm a white man, like
whatever it is. And again, I'm just talking from my experience in psychiatry with this, sort of shrinky. And that's what the IM is for. The IM is a tool. It's a roadmap. That was the best you could do. It doesn't mean it's a free ride. But if you blame yourself instead of looking at why you're doing it, you develop and create resistance. We have created resistance to change by simply using the word disorder in my field. Why on earth would somebody want to come and talk with me if they think they're now going to be viewed as less valuable? And this value it is the common thread of all of us. That's where we have the commonality. We all want to feel valued. So how do we get there? And that's the journey. It is worth it. And I know that we can bring a lot of other people along with it. I agree with you. We need communities, we need coalitions. We need to capitalize on our propensity to form groups. But we need a big, big group that again has a diversity within it, with that one shared belief that you're valuable.
I love it. I love it.
Now, this has been a fantastic discussion. I so appreciate it. More to follow, no doubt. But I know we got to bounce. Small changes can have big effects. The I am, the 4 domains. Brianna, what small change can you recommend to our listeners given our topic?
Small change, I think I would say, is Small change, I would say, is think about the words that you're using online. One of the things I had to learn during Gamergate was when you have a really big platform, you have to learn to use it responsibly. And I often worry that in fighting things, we can become the thing that we're fighting. So my message to anyone out there is, next time you get super riled up online, maybe think twice, like just ask yourself, am I adding to the conversation? There are times where it's very appropriate to put somebody on blast, particularly if they're a public figure. But sometimes it's not. So use that judiciously. Think about that. That would be my message.
Alana, small changes can have big effects. What small change do you recommend to our listeners?
The one I recommend is to be an example. Model the behavior that you want to see in other people. Maybe it's just, I'm not a Christian, having come from the background that I did, but I think a lot of the biblical stuff still kind of resonates with me a little bit. It's literally like, be that example, model that behavior. Don't expect things from other people that you're not willing to do yourself. So that's where, the kindness and compassion comes in. And I feel like from this discussion, people might not get the idea that I'm a compassionate person. I promise I am.
We believe it. Absolutely.
But yeah, that would be my small thing. Just model the behavior that you want to see in other people. The golden rule.
And then my colleague would say the platinum rule. Treat other people the way they want to be treated. So before we go, I know you got to go, but I'm going to start with Brianna. Because the four domains interconnect, not only do small changes have big effects, but you influence everyone. You control no one. You influence everyone. You get to choose the kind of influence you want to be. Brianna Wu, what kind of influence do you want to be?
What kind of influence do I want to be? I think as a leader, I think it's your role in this world to kind of model thoughtfulness and being measured, particularly as I've gotten older. It's really hard, particularly when you're on the left, because you see these systems and it's easy to get very, very angry. So what I try to bring to the world is being thoughtful and measured and strategic in how I voice that out there. So that is how I try and model what I want to see in the world.
And Alana McLaughlin, what kind of influence do you want to be?
I would say that currently my project is to sort of, like with doing the athletic stuff, this is something I struggled with for a bit. I felt like it wasn't important enough to pursue, and that the backlash was just going to be the end of it. But I think for me, I want to sort of be an example for girls, for young women, for trans girls especially, that they don't have to make themselves smaller, and that they're allowed to take up space, whether it be in athletics or anywhere else. That's pretty much it.
It's beautiful.
Thank you so much, both of you. You can read more about this. Unleashing the Power of Respect, the I Am Approach, is one of the books I've written that's out there trying to get people to recognize, when's the last time you got angry at someone treating you with respect? You don't. That is the power that we can unleash. But what the two of you are doing, it is, it's not just compassionate, it's passionate. And that I truly appreciate. I truly appreciate your gift of time. Thank you so much. Tom, nice job. Thanks for putting this together.
Thank you.
I hope we will get a chance to chat again.
I do too. This was good.
Thanks, everybody.
Talk soon. Bye, everybody.
Later.